I hope everyone enjoyed the first panel sessions. Can you hear me now? Good. And I also hope you found time to connect with some old friends and make some new ones during lunch. The session that I was in was talking about hooking up and engaging with new people as a means to encourage inclusion. So long may that continue, at least throughout the day. Our second panel today will explore New Zealand's place in the evolving Asia-Pacific economy at a time of significant geopolitical shifts, legislative changes, and of course, COVID-19, among other issues. And before I introduce our moderator, a reminder to please ask your questions via Slido. Remember to choose the correct session. So this is session 2, geopolitics. There was a session 1, which had a very similar name. Don't put your questions there, we'll miss them. And please keep those social media posts going as well. Our moderator for this important discussion really needs no introduction, but I'll introduce him anyway. Dr. Alan Bollard, Professor of Practice and Inaugural Chair of Pacific Region Business at Victoria University of Wellington. Alan is also the Chair of the Infrastructure Commission, the Centres for Asia-Pacific Excellence, and the New Zealand Portrait Gallery. He is New Zealand Governor of the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. And previous roles have included, among other things, Director of the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research, Chair of the New Zealand Commerce Commission, Secretary to Treasury, Governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, and also 2 terms as Executive Director of APAC. So clearly someone very, very well placed to be leading this discussion today. And I'll hand it over to Dr. Alan Bollard. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, kia ora, everybody, and welcome to this session. We hope it's going to be a great one. We're an informal group sitting as a panel here, and we're going to talk about New Zealand's place in the region, but in the context of New Zealand in a post-COVID world in the region as well. I'm very pleased that we've got a panel that's going to talk very authoritatively and interestingly about all of this, and I'll introduce the panel to you first of all, and then talk to you a little bit about how we'll be running the session. First of all, Sarah Salmon, who's corporate partner, Minter Ellison Rudd Watts, more than 20 years of experience of advising on public, regulatory and international trade law issues. She heads the firm's international trade practice unit, and she spent 10 years working in London, Washington and Paris. Thanks for coming on, Sarah. Brad, you're principal economist and director of the Infometrics organisation and leading economic commentator across New Zealand on a whole range of economic issues, working currently on the reimaginisation of the New Zealand economy after COVID, and something you just said that you were a hot under 25. I don't know if that's
well, I don't know if that's how I describe myself. But.
Yeah. Well, I'm just reading what it says here. Professor Nziia Hui Hung. Nziia is Professor of International Business and Strategy, and he's got the Chair in Business in Asia at Victoria University, and he is also Director of New Zealand's Southeast Asia Centre of Asia-Pacific Excellence. So he'll talk to us from that angle as well. Welcome, Nziia. And then finally, Professor Michael Baker. And Michael is very well known to many of you more recently because he's a public health physician and professor in the Department of Public Health, Otago University. But other positions he holds has been all around the COVID response from New Zealand, and he's a member in particular of the Ministry of Health COVID Technical Advisory Group. Thanks very much for coming into this, Michael. So what we're going to talk about today is basically how we open up, how the region might open up. We're interested from a public health, obviously, but an economic point of view, how we might link to a post-COVID regime around the region, how that might have changed since pre-COVID days. What about these New Zealand returnees and what role they might be playing? How do we stop leaking value and talent out of New Zealand as we do open up again? And how has COVID changed our competitive position in the region after a couple of years of very big change? So we're going to start off asking our panel about opening up and what that might look like. Yesterday, the Minister of Finance was asked that question by a business audience, and he said, there will be restrictions for a very long time. Michael, why do there have to be restrictions? Surely it's not that hard just to open up the borders again.
Yes, well, tēnā koutou katoa. It's great to be here today. This is the first time I've been to one of these conferences before, and it is fascinating. I'm getting a bit of PowerPoint withdrawal at the moment, but I'm coping. And it's great to be part of this multidisciplinary panel looking at regional geoeconomics. And obviously, my focus today will be somewhat on COVID-19 and how it's changing regional economies, and also how it's affecting New Zealand's place in the region. And I think we're doing some opening comments, aren't we, Alan, just for a few minutes. And when we talked about this meeting, we thought that it would be useful if I focused on this whole idea of what opening up actually means. And as I think all of us know, there's a high degree of uncertainty about the pandemic. It's got a long way to run, and it is literally evolving before our eyes in actually a biological sense. And also our response around the globe is adapting to that in a lot of different ways. I think given this focus of this meeting, one of the things I think is fascinating is that the Asia-Pacific region has absolutely forged its own approach to dealing with this pandemic. And multiple countries in this region have adopted an elimination strategy, partly forged, I think, from the experience with SARS in Asia. And this uses basically public health and social measures for the first year. And now, of course, we have vaccines to minimize disease spread. And many countries in the region have done exceptionally well with taking this approach. And it's performed very much better than suppression mitigation approaches used across Europe and North America. And New Zealand has been particularly successful at applying this approach by many different indicators. One of the things I'd say, when you hear a phrase like opening up or learning to live with the virus, I think you have to be extremely skeptical about what that slogan actually means. If you look at the UK at the moment, when Boris Johnson says opening up and learning to live with it, and Freedom Day coming up, I think, this week, we have to say that is actually a huge experiment, a dangerous experiment, I think, that they're about to commence. At the moment, Scott Morrison is saying the same thing. In Australia, we have to open up. We've got our roadmap out, but they're doing exactly the opposite of what the Johnson government is doing. They are actually committing even more intensely to elimination. They're halving the number of people coming into Australia. There's no way they want any circulating virus. Yet he says, oh, Australia is pursuing suppression and then management. Actually, they're pursuing a very intense elimination strategy, the same as New Zealand. And that is why I'm very frustrated with the political discourse around the pandemic, because it's all about political spin, and very rarely is it really helping, I think, countries comparing strategies, which is what we want at the moment. When we say opening up, New Zealand has already gone a long way down that path with its green zone with Australia and the Cook Islands. This is unique globally. There's no other zone in the world where countries have linked up countries pursuing a zero COVID approach. And it has been quite successful. Obviously, part of it is recognizing and managing outbreaks when they occur. The government's flagged that it's going to, and it is actively discussing, what the next stages might be with reconnecting more with the world. And that is really going to be much more relevant towards the end of this year when we have high vaccine coverage. And then it's a very different discussion from how it is at the moment. We should, I think, recognize that New Zealand is in an exceptionally privileged position at a global level. We're enjoying the benefits of elimination, and it also means we can sit back to some extent and see what strategies are working around the globe and learn from them. And some of the things we can learn are how well does vaccine perform, particularly in highly vaccinated populations exposed to more transmissible variants of the virus, and those that may even evade vaccine coverage to some extent. We can also learn about the consequences of long-term infection, particularly in children and young people. It was about 10 million of them are going to get infected in Britain during the course of this year. We can start to do what Australia is doing also, and that's look at reducing quarantine requirements for arriving travellers who are fully vaccinated. I think there's many ways we can enhance this process with good evidence. And one of the big questions is, what's our long-term relationship going to be with this virus? And there are two very different options. We could choose to eliminate it long term, as we do for measles. We don't tolerate living with measles or polio. We have elimination strategies that are very highly evolved. Or we could say, actually, the overall effect of the virus is something we can manage, and it might become an endemic infection, a bit like seasonal flu. But I always say seasonal flu is a terrible benchmark to aim for. It's our biggest single infectious disease killer, averaging about 500 deaths a year. It fills up our hospitals with about 3,000 cases every year. It's actually a terrible thing to aspire to. I would prefer personally to aspire to measles and polio in terms of our long-term relationship with this virus. And finally, I think this is a fantastic opportunity to forge a new path in many key areas. And I think of topics like, as we all know, tourism, migration, sustainability, our approach to climate change. This surely is the great reset opportunity of our generation. Thanks.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much, Michael. Sarah, so Michael says we're in an exceptionally privileged position, but we're a hermit kingdom and businesses can't get in or out. And you're having to deal with a lot of the problems of the bottlenecks and pinch points that are coming out of that in an economic sense. Would you like to tell us a little bit about what it's like trading in this environment, getting investment, migration, and so on?
Thanks, Alan. I'd love to. Good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to be with you today. What I thought I'd do with my introductory remarks is really focus on three things. So what has COVID-19, what impact has that had on New Zealand exports and inward investment? What are the key challenges and opportunities that we're living with right now in this space? And what are some of the key things we need to work on as we start to reopen the economy? So first of all, looking at exports, the great news is there is still very strong demand for New Zealand products. Nevertheless, though, what we see in the last year is a reduction in our export volumes by about 16.5%. And that headline figure marks a very interesting underlying picture about how the New Zealand economy has changed in the past year. So what we've seen is a very big hit taken to three of our services exports. That's the transportation sector, the travel sector, and the education services sector. And clearly when you go from having almost 14 million people coming into the country every year, and then you have 319,000 coming in, it's obvious to understand travel, tourism, and education services have taken a hit. The picture with our goods exports is much more positive. In fact, export volumes are up in the last year than on previous years. The issue, though, is that export values are down. And the reason for this is we are having major trouble getting goods out of the country. There are global problems in this area, but what we're facing in New Zealand is severe congestion at the ports, particularly Port of Auckland. We have shipping delays. We have the containers that have to carry all of our goods to market. They're turning up in the wrong place at the wrong time. And we've got shipping prices now, sea freight prices that are 3 times higher than they were the year before, and are potentially going to hit 4 times higher in the months ahead. So we have some pretty serious issues to deal with, and with 99% of New Zealand's goods exports going by sea, you can understand that these sea freight issues are a real problem. One of the other interesting things I think you can see on the export side, looking at our statistics, is despite the government's best efforts to encourage us to diversify, we've actually become more reliant on China in the last year. So China went from taking 19% of our trade to taking 23% of our trade. And of course, this is quite a contentious issue, and there is a healthy chunk of New Zealand society who feel that we are prioritising our financial well-being potentially over some of our values. But really the big picture I leave you with on exports is that what we really need to do is, as we slowly open up, we're going to have to do a lot to support our transportation, travel and education services sector to get back on their feet. We really need to sort out this shipping ports problem. We need a long-term strategy, and we need some short-term change to alleviate the pressure. And finally, I think we do need to continue on our efforts to ensure diversification. That's just a core tenet of any good risk management strategy. On the investment side, it's been a really interesting picture. So I tell you, my law firm, Inter Ellis & Rudd-Watts, as soon as lockdown happened, we had a completely full book of of investments, mergers, acquisitions, deals. The economy was humming and they literally stalled overnight. There were no deals moving and we were all just sort of sitting around tapping our feet. It took about 2 to 4 months for people to start coming back into the economy, and it was a bit of a roller coaster year, but in the end actually we saw inward investment coming into New Zealand at relatively normal levels. And I think part of the reason for that is people do believe in the global economy that right now New Zealand is a safe haven and a safe place to put your money when times are very difficult. I think that that narrative is going to continue to play out over the coming year. What we have at the moment is a lot of great New Zealand businesses looking for investment or sale at the moment. In fact, we kind of have a bumper crop because less happened last year. So we have all the businesses that would have been looking for investment in 2021 anyway, plus a number who held on and sort of buckled down for the ride during lockdowns and are now looking to sell. There's also a healthy chunk of small business owners, particularly baby boomer generation, who decided COVID taught them life is short, I'm gonna sell out and I'm gonna do something else with my life. So there's a lot of great quality assets for investment. We had expected by now we would start to see a wave of insolvencies, and my insolvency law partner has been very eagerly waiting for that, but it's just not happened, and I really hope that it's not going to happen. We have Kiwi returnees who are well cashed up, and we've seen that sort of lead to a mini boom in terms of investments in small businesses. And also, of course, that's put a bit of pressure on the top end of New Zealand's housing market. And we've also got a lot of money circulating in the system. You're not getting good returns if you put your money in a term deposit, so people are looking for meaningful investment options. One thing that's slowing investment down a little bit is the Overseas Investment Office introduced some emergency notification provisions, which basically mean many more investments of overseas people were up for consideration by the Overseas Investment Office, but those are gone. And generally speaking, I think we're looking at a very good picture on the investment front. But the one challenge we are a bit anxious about is that at the moment, because nobody internationally can go and investigate potential investment options anywhere because most borders are relatively closed, people are willing to invest without laying eyes on things. But as globally we start to open up and other countries become more open than us, we do worry that New Zealand may no longer look like the best place to put your money when you're actually able to visit potential investments in other countries when you won't be able to come here. So I'll leave that with that for the opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Sue. Well, we're going to come back to a number of these issues. We're already getting quite a few questions coming through. Thank you. Brad, excuse me. We're seeing quite a lot of economic activity. And what is this opening up economy going to look like? And actually, is it anything to do with COVID, or do we just have very low interest rates and very high commodity prices?
Well, I mean, cheap money definitely helps. I think we're taking that step back. The reason, right, that we haven't reopened so far is because the economy is in a better position. I think we sort of need to recognise that not only from an economic point of view, but from a social point of view. The polling that's been done by just about every agency under the sun shows that New Zealanders, by and large, don't want to reopen and jeopardise the better economic position we have now by letting COVID-19 come through. And I think, Michael, we heard some of that reasoning before of how damaging it can be and how quickly it can come back through. Importantly there, we've got 5% of the economy, a lot of that tourism-based activity that is much harder to get going at the moment. We can't bring in overseas tourists. That leaves 95% of the economy that is running, generally speaking, like it did before. So again, there's a reason around why there's still that interest in keeping the borders closed. But we're also, I think, getting to the challenging point where other parts of the world are starting to reopen, and it is begging the question here in New Zealand what our reopening looks like and how we can support our economy further. 12 months ago, the issues that we were facing as a country were very much how bad might this get, how many jobs might we lose, how many dollars are not going to go flowing into businesses. Now it's how do I find workers? And I think that's an important challenge because New Zealand has positioned itself quite well, given the COVID crisis, to attract people back. But interestingly, although the media and everyone probably in this room would have you believe that there's been this influx of Kiwis, there haven't. What's actually happened, apart from in March when we did have a bunch of people that rushed back home before we closed the borders, the actual number of migrant arrivals of New Zealanders back into the country has been pretty flat. what it is that people haven't left. Usually we'd have thousands of Kiwis that head off, they go on their OE, they go and move overseas for a period of years. They're not doing that. And the question then becomes, okay, when we do start to reopen, there's a big opportunity, sure, but there's also a big challenge. Might we have a brain drain? Might we lose some of our smartest people overseas? Just as importantly, as the rest of the world sort of moves forward, we know that even those Kiwis who have come back are looking at new opportunities. Of the people who came back through MIQ between August and last year and January this year, MB's survey of those arrivals shows that 24% are essentially keen to head back overseas as quickly as possible if things do improve. And yes, New Zealand seems good now, but as that vaccine rollout moves through, as people are looking for those global opportunities, there's a big risk, I think, that we do have a brain drain. I say that because it's something we've got to consider when we open up. Just as importantly, how do we capitalise on the position that we've got? I mean, we heard this morning from Kurt about how good New Zealand was, and it's always good to hear someone overseas comment about it. But if we've got this good reputation, we've sort of got to do something with it. We can pat ourselves on the back as much as we like, but we've got to capitalise on that value. We've got to figure out how we use that to attract people, how we attract the money, how we attract new potential into the country. Importantly, that extends to trade, and I've got sort of 2 points on this, and I was a little bit surprised at how strong the Prime Minister's comments were this morning about the strength of our exports, because actually, if we look at the numbers at the moment, goods exports into New Zealand fell 1.5% in the March quarter. The world wants to eat the stuff that we're producing. We've got the stuff to produce, but as you heard from Sarah, we can't get it out. We can't send it across the world. And that's important because, again, it suggests that it's not going to be quite as easy as reopening, throwing open the borders, which I think, Michael, you quite well put that it's not quite as simple as absolute fortress New Zealand or everything's the same again. The challenge I think that New Zealand is going to have with that reopening as well is what is our international standing and how do we capitalise on that? We've heard a lot about our independence, a lot about how important that is for the economy, and importantly over the last year, a lot about diversification, particularly away from China. Now, economically speaking, I think we've got to be a little bit more pragmatic about diversification. We're not going to do that when there's so much money on the table coming from China. And I say that because I don't think you're going to see an active shift away from China as one of our major trading partners. Instead, New Zealand as a country, as a trading nation, has to look at where the other opportunities are. It's not a this or that option, it's what else can we do? What sort of additional options are there out there for New Zealand's trade exports? But with that comes the responsibility to think wider, and instead of sort of just sitting there as a country, I think we need to be a lot more pragmatic, a lot more active about searching for our trade opportunities. We've got the good reputation, we've got the skills and talent, we've got the opportunity to trade with the world, but we also need to get back involved. And I guess my final point is the reason I think that reopening is so important is as much as New Zealand's trade is highly transactional, we send you some stuff, you pay us some money. We've also got to realise that making new trade connections does involve a lot more person-to-person, face-to-face interaction. How we do that smartly and support the economy while also securing the strong economic gains we've had from pursuing the elimination strategy has to be, I think, from my point of view, the balancing position for how we keep the economy going, but how we also look to be a global partner in the world.
Okay, thank you. Nziia, back in the 1990s, then Prime Minister Jim Bollard came out and said, we're all Asians now. And there was a big outpouring of protest that we weren't. But actually, when it came to lockdown, we did it the Asian way, not the European way. So bigger government, more intrusive government, more controllers, and so on. How do you think we're being seen in all of this from that Southeast Asia region?
All right, thanks, Alan. So, did Jim Bollard send you to APEC Secretariat, is my question?
No, he didn't. He was
okay.
out by then.
To make you more Asian, yes. Right, okay, now being an anchor person is always good to say that I agree with all my co-panelists, right? I agree with everything that they say. It's all great, thank you very much, guys, right? But I got a slightly different perspective to this one, right? So I think in a nutshell, what I'm going to go through is a few bullet points, but I think ultimately, I think there's going to be a bit of thinking around the fact that, okay, when do we know that it's going to be open? The next question, Michael is going to pick up the battle on that one, I presume. So while waiting for Michael to happen, now the next question here is then what are we supposed to do? right? Are we supposed to make coffee and tea for Michael while he, pick up the big fights over these things? But at the same time, I think New Zealand's advantage actually happens now when we are in some kind of lockdown. Well, not lockdown, actually, we sort of close our doors, right? So there is a lot of advantage that we actually have, right, in terms of what we are supposed to do around the world. Now, there's a few bullet points right here, right? So Bloomberg's COVID resilience ranking. Okay, New Zealand is actually number 2. Guess who is number 1? United States. And of course, guess who is complaining about it? China, right? So and then in the last 2-3 weeks, US become number 1. Accidentally, for whatever reasons, New Zealand become number 2. Australia 7, China mainland 8, South Korea 10, and Singapore 13. Now, what does that tell us, right? It means that there's a lot of things that New Zealand has that the rest of the world is recognizing. We are number 2 in terms of the resilience, which means that we are reopening in progress, okay? Now, barring the fact that we are slow in that process, but there's a lot of high value add and other things that I want to promote to ourselves. So Brad talks about a lot about the migrants kind of issue, and I suspect some of you, maybe not here, you must be picking fruits yourself, right? We not have enough migrants to pick your fruits, right? So our productivity is a bit down, but our export numbers are okay, but not that great, right? But that's because we are looking at one side of our exports. There are a lot of other exports that distance doesn't matter that much, like digital exports, creative exports, sort of the exports of sharing processes and all these other things, right? We should be starting to see as the kind of COVID hits us, right? How can we actually respond despite the fact that we are waiting for the reopening to actually happen, right? So I'm actually exploring that kind of 15-month kind of down the road as well. Sharing of knowledge, right? Is there enough that we can share around, not within just New Zealand, but also with those countries out there, Asia, about how we actually deal with the fact that we are having a big party here of 200 of us. Like a lot of these foreign diplomats always tell me, this place is unreal. I promised them, guys, these are not holograms. We are real human beings having a drink together, right? So they actually don't know how we do it, but we managed to do it in some way. So there must be a lot of notes around in that sense, right? Now, some of the trading numbers are down, but I suspect that more are trading in terms of the digital aspects of things. And at the end of the day, our trading to GDP percentage is actually not very high, so there's a lot more there. And I encourage us to think about the high value add, high margin way. I'm not asking us to be, sort of bad business people who try to profiteer from this pandemic, but I'm saying that, New Zealand doesn't have enough capacity in a lot of industries, so let's try to think of ways to innovate, right, so that we can actually protect that kind of margins over there. Surely health and related products and services, we have lots to offer, right, in that sense. Now, bear in mind that COVID is just one problem around the Asia markets, for example, or the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific markets. And that's because they have other things around pollution, right, inadequate arable land, sustainability issues, full of plastics. I hope there's no plastics around here, but we'll see. Right? So there's a lot of things there that will be existing regardless of COVID, and that's something that we should start thinking about as well, right? On top of the fact that we are just waiting for COVID to happen and we go back to our usual suspects of export markets, right? And so on and so forth. So we should respond immediately to COVID in that sense. Now, finally, I want to add that business connectivity can become a challenge, right, over time. So, I mean, from those markets out there, if you are the business person, you probably will know that nothing do better than having a quick coffee and a drink, right? And interaction is quite important, right? Interaction is extremely important if you are meeting the person for the first time. Just trying to meet a new person for the first time in Zoom, right? I suspect most of you will agree it's quite awkward. Right, so I think interaction is quite important. So I hope that when the reopening actually happens, one of those that will go out there will be the business guys who can, sort of continue to get the interaction going, because in most of the Asia markets, multiple interaction per year is necessary. It's not enough to once in a while give them a call and say, look, let's do things together. Right, so it's extremely difficult. That would be my long response to your short question, Alan.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Steve. Michael, Sid talked about 15 months out. Is it realistic to think in 15 months, those people who want to get vaccinated have been vaccinated, and let's assume it's the majority of the New Zealand population, we've got some sort of certification system with some international validity that would mean vaccinated people can travel and come back in without going through an MIQ process, and that we don't achieve maybe a vision of eradication, because the world isn't going to, but we're definitely there for control. Does that look realistic?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there'll be growing evidence that if you're fully vaccinated, possibly with a pre-departure test, that it's fine for you to cross borders and avoid quarantine. I think that's very likely. We're just waiting really for evidence. I mean, I know in Australia and other countries, they'll be testing this out experimentally.
But what are we waiting for at the minute? Why can't you do that right now?
I think
Get vaccinated and travel freely.
Yeah, I think the evidence isn't robust enough, but I think it will be not far off. The other thing is, it'll be different when New Zealand and Australia are highly vaccinated also, because then the consequences of an outbreak are so much less severe.
Michael, can I ask a question just sort of related to that in terms of, I've heard the finance minister make this point last night, and in fact the Prime Minister made the same point this morning around after, from Sir David Skegg, after 9/11, you know, the way that we flew around the world changed. I mean, what might that look like? I'm more thinking in sort of 5 years' time. It's obviously not that you just hop on a plane and jet across. Is it that, you know, at some point you are going to have maybe not MIQ, but you have to self-isolate for a few days until you get a negative test? Or, I mean, what could some of those options be? And I guess I ask because it is important from my point of view, thinking about the people that are flowing in and out of the country. I sort of wonder, could I go on an OE myself? You know, are people going to be able to take up internships, say in Asia? Is the usual going to be that, you know, all the law students after 5 years go across to the UK? Is it going to be quite as simple as that bounce back? Or what, I mean, what are the options? Is probably from an economic view what I'm interested in.
Well, I think from a safety point of view, things will be very manageable for travel within a year. I imagine for high-income countries will be highly vaccinated with very effective vaccines. We'll also know a lot more about the behavior of the virus in highly vaccinated populations. We may well decide that actually we can live with the virus. We can have endemic infection, and the consequences are manageable. We just don't know at the moment, because in the end, there's going to be an equilibrium between population immunity and viral evolution. And this you cannot predict until you actually see this happening in a dynamic system. So certainly in a year's time, we'll have a much better idea about that. But also, I think the world's vaccine manufacturing capacity is going to be enormous by this time next year. There will be enough vaccine for the entire planet. It'll just be a matter of delivery will be the hold-up, and obviously some failed states. Just as we have with polio and measles, we have the tools to eliminate these viruses from large swathes of the earth. It's just that the countries are not always organized enough to deliver it. That's the problem. And after all, managing infectious disease has never been just about a vaccine. It's always had public health measures alongside that. Polio or smallpox was eliminated not with global coverage, but with ring vaccination. So just using these, delivering these tools in very intelligent ways, that's how we will deal with this virus. And unfortunately, the World Health Organization is so under-resourced and underpowered, it's not giving the global leadership that we need. And I think there's a long list, everyone here would have a long list of lessons from the pandemic. One is, and I think Helen Clark's group highlighted this, the panel that looked at the New World Order, is that multilateralism in the form of an organization like the World Health Organization has never been more important, because they cannot give even the most basic leadership in the world at the moment on this pandemic. And I think that's something we can hopefully all get behind.
Well, we'll hear some of that next week with the leaders' APEC meeting, where they are spending a lot of time trying to work out ways of getting better movement of vaccines and better movement of people. But I am reminded that I did hear a conversation between two lab mice, one of them saying to the other, "Are you going to get the jab?" And the other one says, "Hell no, I'm going to wait till they've finished the human trials first." Sarah, are we going to see in your area lawyers going off overseas, young lawyers going off overseas again? Are you finding that those that have come back are available for employment? Are you going to end up paying Wall Street salaries in Auckland in order to keep them? And of course, it isn't just lawyers, it's many other professions and many other areas of skills as well. We want to use them, but as Brad said, we've seen some coming back only to find safe haven and then head off again very quickly. And sometimes they're coming back at taxpayer expense, and actually most of them haven't paid taxes in New Zealand.
All very good questions, Alan. So what we have found, actually I saw some really interesting stats internally from our firm, is that very few young people left on an OE in the past year. In fact, we've had almost no attrition. And I fully expect that as the world starts to open up, people will go on the traditional OE again. I don't think that that's going to change. We're already seeing now, actually, coming up in the next 2 or 3 months, lawyers looking to go to the UK despite the virus. So I think that we will see the continuation of people leaving. And the challenge I think we're going to have is, as we watch those lawyers leaving, if we don't bring anyone else in to fill those jobs. So I think one of the urgent things really that we need to do is look very carefully at our immigration and labour market settings. We heard earlier today we have got a desperate shortage in New Zealand of people who work traditionally low-paid jobs, such as construction workers, hospitality, some healthcare workers, etc. And we have a lot of highly educated people who want to come to New Zealand, some of whom are New Zealanders and have come, but some who have still got a visa application in the queue. And I think if we don't let them in and we watch some of our younger talent resume their OEs, we are going to have a labour market problem. So it is something that needs a bit of attention.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we do have leaky economy problems. Talent leaking out is one thing. It's not just talent though. A lot of value on New Zealand commodity products leaks out. And if Singapore really, in areas like infant formula, adds more value to New Zealand milk powder than we do, there's something pretty funny about that, but I think that is the case. Tax leaks out of New Zealand as well. We're getting a few questions coming through from the audience about how to avoid that leakage, how to keep it in New Zealand, how to get full value. Brad, any thoughts?
I think part of that comes back to our productivity issue. Now, I'm an economist, and so I'm always going to use the P word, and everyone's going to probably roll their eyes, and I understand that. But it does come back to how do we ensure that we are sort of operating in a much stronger position so that we can pay some of those high wages. We move away from some of the low-skilled, low-paid talent that Sarah's been talking about, but that we sort of think about how do we essentially work smarter, not harder. Now, that's going to take a range of areas, but what's interesting, I guess, is that we've had this period for a long time in New Zealand where we've had industries that have struggled to get going further, to capitalise, to invest in, and to actually see a lot more of that happen here in New Zealand. I think we sort of need to get away from the fact that if we just sort of wait, it will naturally occur because market pressures will put it that way. And I say that because, look, New Zealand's small. Let's be absolutely clear. We're 5 million odd people. The team of 5 million is great, but it's also a small team relative to everyone else. And it means that a lot of our businesses, when we talk about SMEs, we talk much more about the S than the M's in that regard. It's hard to find scale, it's hard to capitalise further, it's hard to move away from labour because it's such an easier option. And so I think one of the things that government did really well last year, in my mind, was providing some more investment support for businesses. How could you de-risk some of that investment so that we can buy smarter machines to do some of the work that we're not able to do with humans, that we can make greater value out of the stuff that we bring forward. So I think there's a big element there around how do we ensure that we're getting the right investment coming through. But I think it also probably speaks to what we sell ourselves as New Zealand. I say that because I think it's important to recognise why everyone's in this room, and that is sort of considering New Zealand's stake in the world and where we're positioned. What are the options if people are going overseas to bring them back? How do we attract Kiwis to come home? What's the option there? You talk to a young Kiwi overseas at the moment and they'll tell you, well, yeah, I could come back and pay really high house prices and I may or may not, find a job and it's still difficult to feel connected to back home. I say that because we've got to get some of the fundamentals right if we're actually going to sell ourselves. But importantly, and we talked a little bit before about our labour market settings and similar, I think we also need to be a little bit careful with how New Zealand is pushing itself out to the world. The government is currently undergoing what it's calling an immigration reset. Now, talking to people overseas, the way that's perceived, rightly or wrongly, but this is how the international world is viewing us a bit more, is that there's going to be much more limited immigration coming into New Zealand. Almost you're not welcome here, the door is closed sort of position. And I say that because if that is how the rest of the world is seeing New Zealand, we might have a problem on our hands where we do have more people that are keen to head out than come back in. So we've got to be careful, I think, with that messaging of how we interact with the world. We need to maintain our very strong position, our strong healthcare focus, and work on how we get more Kiwis into work. But I don't think it's quite so easy to say we need to get rid of sort of foreign talent and we'll just get all these Kiwis back into work. Before COVID-19, there were 150,000 New Zealanders on a job seeker benefit. That's without COVID-19, that's because we really struggled to get them into work. It's not that we don't have enough people, it's we don't have the right skills, and that goes again to our education settings, our productivity. How do we get the people with the talent here and the employers who want to do jobs intersecting much more? That's a larger challenge, but also given we're in this reset position, that's the sort of place that New Zealand can be in. Importantly, let's stop, in a sense, thinking so small-minded. Let's take some of those good ideas, let's rip them off from overseas, work them in a New Zealand context, because what was fascinating on a panel I was on a few weeks back was talking to expat Kiwis who'd moved back. They said, you come back to New Zealand and your business that you've come into says, oh, that's interesting, but that's not how we do things here in New Zealand. We've got to change that mindset. We should be taking the good ideas from anywhere we can and utilising them here in New Zealand. We can do that while still pushing the economy forward by getting more Kiwis into work. There's huge opportunities, I think, out there.
Thank you. Nziia, the experience from Singapore, Malaysia, countries like that, I mean, they've had a tough time with a lot of population flows bringing in COVID. Singapore's broadly repressed it, but not entirely. Malaysia sounds like it's bubbling away a bit again now. Can you draw any relationship between how they've managed that and how their economies are doing currently? And also, how do they look at New Zealand COVID-free, and what do they think about that?
In a nutshell, those guys will say, look, you guys are unreal, okay? So that's for sure. Now, in terms of opening and closing, we definitely can sort of, it's an interesting kind of elements, right? So if you sort of live in Asia, right, and Alan mentioned the example of Singapore and Malaysia, you will be used to the fact that you'll be locked down anytime, anywhere. Right, and in fact, right, it might be just states like like what the Australians are doing nowadays, right? Lockdown on states and for a week and two, but it's an interesting element, right? So I think New Zealand has a slightly different approach to it. So we have lockdowns of 3 days, 5 days, but if you actually look across those countries, they normally lock down straight away for 2 weeks because it's easier. Like some of the businesses would tell you, it's easier to manage how they conduct business if it's not just for 2-3 days because you don't know what to do. Right, every other night, right? So there's a bit of a challenge there, but on the other hand, they also struggle in the sense that they know the 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 1 month lockdown is going to take a bullet, right? So they take bullets for a lot of the kind of lockdowns that there have been, but they also know that if you know Singapore is a hub, right? They have no choice but to open. If they don't open, there's not going to be a lot of flights, not even mercy flights that can cut across a lot of the different continents, right? So they have to stay open itself as a hub. It has to remain as a hub. Now, Malaysia has the same kind of conceptualization because Malaysia is also another hub, but it's for the manufacturing side of things. Singapore is more of the services and financial side of things in terms of the hubbing. So that's my brief comparison there.
Brad, one reason why New Zealand economy is going quite strongly at the moment is the government got a lot of money out very quickly, $50 billion roughly speaking, out into wage subsidies, business support, and did it fast, and probably did it as well as anywhere in the OECD in that sense. But of course, many other countries have been doing the same sort of thing, and now there's much more government spending than we've ever seen before in human history. By some measures, if we're adding fiscal policy stimulus with sort of some estimate of monetary policy stimulus, it could be $20 trillion. That's $20 trillion. Has anybody got any idea what $20 trillion looks like? No, because it's never happened before. Now, that's going to have to be paid back at some stage. Could that drive us into quite a difficult position out there in a couple of years?
It could, and I think, look, and you know this just as well, if not better than I, what it also does is that every dollar that you and I and everyone in this room has in their back pockets is worth comparatively less. There's only so many goods you can buy, but we've all got more cash. I say that because there is, I think, a rising risk around inflation, and I'll get back to that in a second, because there's an interesting element in terms of the international sphere there. I do think we need to sort of step back and realise why we had to take such strong positions, if you will, on providing such support to the economy. One of the reasons that economists like myself got it so wrong last year, and we freely admit it, was because we hadn't seen that level of support ever before. If you remember back to the GFC, the response from governments around the world was to tighten your belt, to go into austerity, cut the budget, don't spend as much money, hunker down for a period. And instead this time New Zealand was probably the leading country really of getting money out there, but getting it out there fast. And I say that because you look at, say, the US, who had a really dark period of their economy last year, but a much stronger one this year. A lot of that was because they let people lose jobs and gave them unemployment support on that. And I can understand, but they lost 1 million jobs at one point quite quickly, and then have eventually been able to bring those back up. New Zealand said, actually, instead of letting people lose their jobs and helping them once they've lost their jobs, what happens if we didn't make them lose their jobs in the first place? Now, that's difficult to do overall, all the time, but it's important to realise that as we went into lockdown, no one knew how long this thing was going to take, and so the idea was, instead of businesses taking a knee-jerk reaction, if the government sort of subsidises some of that support with the wage subsidy, with $16 billion, supporting 3/4 of the New Zealand workforce, you can keep people going for a longer time. So I think it's important also to recognise if we hadn't done that, we'd have many more people out of work, we'd have a much harder position to move forward on the economy. So that spending's been important. Do we have to pay it back? Not necessarily, and I say that because post the Christchurch earthquakes, and the GFC, when we did see quite a high level of government debt come on board, we actually haven't paid any of that back if you look at the Crown accounts. What we have done is, since then, we haven't taken on as much debt, and it says that with this debt level, the spending that we're taking on board now, it means that we can't do as much in future time. So I think we've just got to be realistic that when we look at money, there's essentially just brought it forward from the future, right? But it does also suggest we've got to be careful about those price rises. Now, I say that because in the last decade or so prior to COVID-19, we saw a very low inflation environment. Now, that was good in a sense for households, meant that prices weren't going up so much. A great component of that, or a large factor, was because we were getting very low inflation from overseas. China was sort of the manufacturing hub of the world, and it was able to pump out anything you wanted at a much lower price than most other countries. That shifted a little bit, particularly in the last 6 months, where from China you're seeing a greater focus than before on environmental regulation and similar, which is meaning that you're not going to have as cheaper goods relative to normal going forward. That's important from a climate change point of view, but it also says that we may well be in the sort of the hottest inflationary period we've seen in a generation or so. And I think that's just important to keep aware of, because although the counterfactual to doing what we did was many more people losing jobs, I don't think we can think we got away scot-free. We just sort of shifted a lot of that spending into the future. It means we've got to be much more careful about what we do into the next few years.
Okay. But just going back to what you're saying about debt, of course, after the global financial crisis 10, 12 years ago, there was some complaint about austerity policies, trying to get debt back down again. And some people have been saying, well, we're not going to do that again. We don't want austerity policies. Do you want austerity policies?
Not necessarily. I think there's a balancing point, right, between not necessarily cutting your budget, but also not overstimulating. You look at the economy at the moment, it's probably running too hot in a sense right now, because we've got supply issues, we've got skill shortages, you can't find a builder for love nor money, there's some real challenges there. So it suggests that maybe we overcooked it last year. Now, I'm not saying we should go back and unwind it, that we shouldn't have done it, but we probably should unwind some of what we've got now, because again, all we're doing is drawing the money from the future and pulling it into now. I think we just sort of need to say to people, actually, tai-ho, let's chill out a little bit and leave some more of that spending for the next few years. And I say that from a government point of view as well, in terms of we have some big issues in this country we've got to solve. We've got climate change, we've got housing, we've got child poverty. All of that's an ongoing issue. You don't solve that with a click of fingers in 1 year with a big boost in spending. And so I think we've just got to be careful that although we're trying to solve the issues of today, there's not that many issues at the moment that actually require a huge amount of cash from government. You talk to businesses and they're not going, crikey, I wish I had some more money. They're saying, I wish I had some more ships. Or I had some more workers, and there are constraints, realistic constraints on that. So I think we need to be probably cooling back some of our investment, providing for those future issues, But also, and one thing I was fascinated to read recently, and Michael, I expect you'll agree with this sort of view, that this is not the only pandemic we're going to have. We're going to have more of these issues that start to come forward. We've got to have, at some point, a rainy day fund to support some of that spending, because as good as the wage subsidy is, it's not necessarily the one bazooka that you can shoot once and you hope never comes again. Something like this will come back, and we're going to have to be ready for it.
So, Michael, there's actually been some questions coming through about variants on COVID and whether they're going to be a significant new challenge. And like, I mean, in Churchill's words, is this the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning, or what? And are you really in the mood to talk about new pandemics?
Yeah, well, we've had a number of major pandemic threats already in this millennium. SARS, MERS, and this is our third coronavirus. We've had one flu pandemic already in 2009. Fortunately, it was at the benign end. So I think, yes, just in a purely evolutionary biology sense, humans are now the ultimate host for any emerging virus. And there are literally millions of viruses in the animal world, because they're not quite like species. They have a almost continuous distribution. So there are many things that can potentially cross a species barrier. There does seem to be evidence these events are becoming more common. So I think we do have to plan for future events of this scale. And the great news is that we have discovered that no matter how infectious a respiratory pathogen is and how dangerous, we can stop it. And we didn't know that before the start of last year. So that's great. We can stop flu pandemics. In fact, as you all know, flu has actually stopped circulating, seasonal flu. It's much less infectious than COVID-19. So we know the tools work, and that's great. And I think everyone in the world knows these tools work. And we've got better paradigms, I think, for thinking collectively. So I'm very optimistic about our ability to manage these threats in the future. And as we've seen, as we're hearing, actually many economic activities can continue. And of course, we've never entirely closed our borders. Might have been one day when no one came or left last year, which was remarkable, but people can still move across borders in carefully controlled ways. So and we'll be able to get better at this. We'll learn from this. So, and I think the advances in biotechnology are phenomenal. We've got these new platforms for manufacturing new vaccines very swiftly. The mRNA platform is remarkable. It's very quick and versatile. So I think in many ways, the future is looking good for managing these threats, but we know we have to keep investing in that. And I think the biggest investment is really about people and systems, and also institutional arrangements, so you know who has to do what when. And we haven't had that in New Zealand. And this is something we could get onto in a minute. We have really systematically downsized, eroded, and fragmented a lot of our core science sector, and we've learnt we know what we have to create now, and it's very different from what we had.
Do you want to expand on
that? Well, I think one of the opportunities for the future is more R&D spending, but also I think there are core science activities that do need to be on tap. You just don't say, we'll hope that someone from the university is interested in surveillance and pandemic diseases. And in a way, this is a cottage industry in New Zealand responding to the pandemic. Most of the labour is donated that's responded to this in terms of at least a lot of the discourse amongst scientists. And that's one of the, I guess, reasons we have universities, is you've got this capacity of people who can stop their day jobs, suspend it for a long time and help out. But that's what's got us through. I mean, the genomics started because there was a very good scientist who'd started at University of Otago, Dunedin, and just had those skills. If she hadn't been in the country, we wouldn't have been able to do it. So that's how ad hoc it has been. But fortunately, and I think this may be a tribute to the way New Zealand operates, the village, that everyone got together and made it happen.
So we've sort of, Sarah, been talking about borders, whether they're open or closed, or they're a little bit different from what they used to be. I'm teaching at Victoria University at the minute, and class I was teaching yesterday has got a bunch of people in the room, and then somebody in Auckland, somebody in Apia, somebody in Beijing, somebody. It's pretty hard to teach a traditional class like that, even on Zoom, and it's not so good for them either. How are you getting on with Zoom with your staff? Do they all want to stay at home? Can they do the business that way? Are you finding relationships starting to erode internationally because you can't get alongside people face to face? And what are you hearing from business in all of that respect?
So I guess I'd like to take that in two parts and look at sort of my international Zoom experience and my domestic Zoom experience. Internationally, as a lawyer focused on international issues, I probably would do an average of 2-ish Zoom calls with international people every day. What's interesting to me, I don't think I've seen someone wear a suit on a Zoom call since...
Not even the top half.
I don't know what they're wearing on the bottom, but they're not wearing a suit on the top. And it shows to me that even when they are based in a town that is not locked down, a lot of professional people have still been at home. So in the States or the UK, people have been at home for a year. And actually Zoom is working really well because instead of what we would have once done is probably just converse by email, or maybe you'd pick up the phone with one person, we're actually getting together as groups regularly as a matter of course and feeling free to do it whenever we want. So actually I think I'm actually closer to my international clients and colleagues in a Zoom world than we ever have been before. So I think that's a positive. I think Zoom domestically has also been a positive, particularly for women. So I'm a mum with 3 young kids. I found the lockdowns very hard, but I was able to stay connected to my team, to my clients, because I could do that in Zoom and I could hide in a bathroom, I could do whatever. And I think it has enabled us to work at interesting times of the day, and I do think actually people are quite enjoying it. So I think one of the great things to come out of this pandemic is the connectedness, both domestically and internationally, that we've been able to get via Zoom.
So you're running the Southeast Asia Centre for Asia Pacific Excellence. 2 years ago, you were taking a lot of younger people offshore, you were doing a lot of internships into the region. There were business people moving backwards and forwards. There's a lot of business courses going on. How has that all changed, and what's going to happen on that?
Yeah. Now we just do the Kiwi way, domestic, right? So I think, again, I think it's almost like a sort of a quick response to the kind of trouble of being unable to actually travel. So at the end of the day, you know, I mean, if you want to say enable Kiwis or New Zealanders in general to be able to engage with the region, the last thing we want is that, oh, because we can't travel, so let's forget about those countries and we will talk to you 2 years later, right? Maybe 5 years later. So it's going to be a bit of a problem. So I think we need to stay connected. And one of the ways to do it is to make sure that we probably have to zoom in those in the regions, including our New Zealand representation over in those countries, and it's not just sort of the New Zealand Inc. representation, but also we have a lot of Kiwis out there who can still share a lot of knowledge about what is going on out there for us. At the same time, you know, I think there's a lot of knowledge base that is already here, like Brad has mentioned that there are enough Kiwis who have come back, although not as many as what Brad has said as well, but there's enough knowledge out there that comes back to New Zealand at some point. So we do have quite a bit of pockets there to learn before we head up. So I take it as a lesson to respond that maybe, you know, traveling out there is actually stage 2, right? Stage 1 is the ability to enable here, and hopefully the gate will be open pretty soon.
Can I just touch on that? Because it was interesting in terms of, you know, if we're using, say, Zoom or not, and how we're interacting or not overseas, but also, Sarah, you mentioned, you know, for women in the workforce, you know, it being a real opportunity. And I guess from my point of view, I mean, I was where most of the students were 4 years ago, which is ironic, I know, but it was interesting because I think there's a big opportunity there for our younger talent as well in the economy, but also sort of, you know, we've been talking about what are the opportunities post-COVID, and I think embracing digital technologies is a real area that we can look at more. A personal story, if you will, that I tell often is when we went into level 4 lockdown, after the PM announced we were moving there, I said to the boss, hey, can I have approval for a Zoom account? I want to do some webinars for clients. And he sort of looked at me and said, Brad, I understood about half that sentence, but okay, go for it. A week later, from my ironing board in my flat in Wellington, because I didn't have a desk, you know, classic Zoomer, we were doing webinars, and as economists, we tracked the numbers. The boss sort of said, how are we doing? And I told him the numbers, and he said, that's more people that you've engaged with in 1 hour than we've done in 2 years combined. In terms of you can access people so much more. You can access, you know, various bits of talent from overseas. You don't have to worry about flights, MIQ. you don't even have to worry as much about time zones anymore. You can sort of chuck on maybe not even a blazer to start with, get out of bed, prop up your laptop and do it. But I say that because I think that's the sort of area we do need to be embracing more and more. Those are where some of our technological advancements are going to come from. That's where more money flows are going to come in. But importantly, I think until we open the borders, that's going to be the way that we have to connect with our overseas partners, friends, allies, whatever you want to term them. But it also suggests that we do need to sort of keep that pressure up. I mean, one of the things I've reflected on talking to a number of people in this room is that as New Zealanders, we're small fry in a sense. We do punch above our weight, don't get me wrong, but we're never, going to get in the room necessarily because we're invited. We've sort of got to kick our way through the door a little bit more. And I say that because I think it highlights to me that when we think about these digital emerging technologies and similar, we've got to sort of keep pushing ourselves and again, be much more active rather than just passively waiting for things to come on. So a massive opportunity there, not only for young people to get, I think, more involved in business and similar, but for us as a country to start embracing more of those solutions, taking them overseas and earning some more money from them.
Can I add that, again, I want to emphasize that there's a lot to be learned even within New Zealand in itself, right? Given the kind of people we have in this room, to be able to share a lot of things. And New Zealand it's not a small country by geographical mass. And if you look at the number of cities that are sort of very high in terms of the GDP per capita, we do have a lot of economy out there within New Zealand that I think a lot of us don't explore, because the first thing that we talk about engagement straight away, we try to buy an etiquette, right? And I suspect that may not be the best way to approach it, right? I think we probably can build from here, right? And then move out when it's ready.
Of course, we hear a lot of problem sectors with COVID shutdown, but in fact, if you look both in New Zealand and overseas, there's a heap of tech businesses doing really, really well. And although it's too early to get the numbers yet, I think we're going to find the tech startup rate in New Zealand is very high at the moment. And some of those will do very well, and they'll be quite different from the commodity ones. If it wasn't for COVID, at the minute, you'd all be extremely aware about APEC and New Zealand hosting. So I don't know about New Zealand always being polite in these things. New Zealand is kicking the door a little bit in APEC. There's actually over 300 Zooms meetings, well, they're not Zooms, they're Teams, I think, but meetings going on right at the minute around all the APEC working groups. And they're using COVID and vaccination and post-COVID movement as a leverage device to try and open up or keep opening up trade, investment, movement, and so on right around the region. And actually, it is something that can, in some ways, bring together economies that are diverse and have been opposed, as China and the United States just more recently. So some of that's happening, and some of it's due to technology. And I think we will find that we have actually had a big technology gain as we go through all of this. The Slido question that has been most popular right through this session has been a phrase that is used a lot, is we should build back better. Well, I mean, I guess we all sort of agree, but what does that actually mean in terms of building back better? And that also talks about inequalities, and it's quite complex distributional stories coming out of COVID. There's some people and some businesses hurting, there's others actually doing all right, and there's others that are churning around a bit and will end up in slightly different directions. Any thoughts about what build back better means, or you might like to see in your particular areas, Michael, for example?
Yeah, well, I think we all have a long list of things we think should happen, improvements in terms of health, sustainability, productivity, and so on. But also I think we can look at, there's a subset of those where the COVID experience has made them more real because we've actually had to live them very quickly. And one of the ones I find really interesting is the greater acceptance of the benefits of collective action, and also I think the place of government when we need them. And I think that's been valuable. I mean, I think the areas more in the health sector area, an absolute revolution in the whole process of healthcare consultations and healthcare information. Obviously a huge shift in infection prevention and control ideas. The fact that in winter last year, we missed winter mortality. We normally have 2,000 people die over winter from circulating respiratory infections. It didn't happen. So when we add up the savings of lives from the COVID response, we would have had about 8,000 people die from COVID-19 if we'd had the average OECD mortality. So on top of that, we had 2,000 lives saved. So we actually had the biggest decline in all-cause mortality seen in the world last year. And it reminds us that those people die in winter don't need to die in the future. So that was an innovation in thinking. I think questions about mental health and connectivity, thinking about food security and sovereignty, universal basic income, health and safety in the workplace, the need for commuting and all the things that go with that, road crashes, air pollution. Homelessness vanished for several weeks last year. An intractable problem was solved. So I think these are really vivid examples of what the COVID response and experience has shown us.
Thanks.
I might chip in on the Build Back Better thing, but look at it through a trade and investment lens and simultaneously pick up three other questions that have popped up about diversification. I think one of the ways that our exporters can build back better is diversify their export destinations. We see both as a result of the COVID-19, but also as a result of geopolitical tensions with China. We're constantly hearing, you must diversify, you must diversify. Unfortunately, it's not just as simple as sort of turning your steamship and going elsewhere, and it really does take a long time to cultivate a new market. You need to find business partners, develop supply chains, get distribution agreements going, get a marketing strategy going. It's not that easy, but there is a lot of support out there for exporters that are looking to diversify. You'll know that both MFAT and Nziia have got significantly increased budget contributions in the last budget, and there is a lot of help out there for small and medium-sized enterprises that are looking to diversify. And obviously the place where you diversify to very much depends on what you make, but I think it's really, if you are looking to diversify, do look at the support available from the government to help you do that.
Do you think supply chains are going to change ongoing after COVID?
I think they're going to have to, because we've got these pressure points that we've been talking about with port congestions and shipping, and I know that we had the Minister of Transport in our office on Friday, and he was saying he's developing a long-term strategy to address these issues, but we certainly need some short-term fixes to alleviate pressure points. I mean, I think ultimately still about 90-something% of New Zealand exports will still go via sea. It's not realistic to think it'll ever be affordable to send them by air, but I think we are going to have to tweak a number of our settings to be sustainable on supply chains in the future.
To pick up on the diversification point, I think it does require us, I think, to have a much more comprehensive strategy around diversification. I mean, we've heard a lot today about what we're currently focused on when it comes to trade agreements. We've just upgraded recently the China FTA. We're looking at agreements with Europe, with the UK. We want one with the US. None of those are diversified markets. They're all the places we generally trade with. And I say that just because those will be important, don't get me wrong, but what are the other markets that we seem to be exploring? And more importantly, a number of those markets we've tried to get into before. Now, I will be a little bit controversial here because I think it's a challenge that we in this room do need to grapple with is New Zealand's put its cards on the table. We're keen as beans to get involved in a lot of these sort of trade policies. And in a sense, I think there's only so long that New Zealand's going to try and push that before there are other opportunities that we're going to look for. The New Zealand door is open. We've made it clear that we're open for business. And I think, importantly, we need to start knocking on some other doors as well. Important to look at those current trade opportunities, but talking to everyone, it doesn't seem like we're necessarily the block in the room. And I think other countries, if we are going to sort of be that independent, voice that we often put ourselves out to be, we also need to be realistic that, look, we're only not going to knock on the door so many times before our efforts are expended. And, we've got only so much time. We need to be looking elsewhere, I think. So, looking at those other trade options are going to be better. I also, and this is only, I feel like I'm being trying to be controversial now, but I do challenge the Build Back Better stuff a little bit. I mean, you look out there in the economy, you tell me what's different from what it was pre-COVID. Apart from house prices being 30% higher, it seems relatively pretty normal. I mean, we're working from home, that is a shift, but a lot of the other work, I feel like we have actually gone back much more towards normal. We saw that bounce back pretty quickly as we move forward. And I say that because I think the challenge does need to be well, what are we thinking of doing differently? What are those opportunities that we're starting to pick up? I mean, we talk, and Michael, you're right around homelessness, that we did eliminate that for a wee while. State housing waitlist is now over 23,000 people. I mean, it hasn't got better, we haven't built back better, we've built back worse in a sense. And I say that because the challenge is that we have to be thinking differently. And I worry that almost, in a sense, because of how good our economic response has been, and this is not necessarily a criticism, it's a challenge, because of how good that response has been, we've become a little bit more complacent about where we've moved to as an economy because we haven't had the challenges that I think other places have had. And I just say that because if we do want to be internationally competitive, if we want to use that COVID advantage that we've built up, now's the time to spend that advantage because it's very slowly, quickly rather, slipping away. Other countries are starting to nip at our heels, and there's only so long I think that we can continue on the same path and hope that something different happens. I think you'll find that's the definition of insanity.
You did say New Zealand doors are open for business. Actually, that's not really true. International education, students can't get in, and the sort of message we're getting is probably not next year as well, by which stage they'll have found other places to go. And I think we have to sort of be realistic. We're top of the world in terms of COVID non-contraction. We're pretty near the bottom in terms of vaccination. I know that's not just the New Zealand government's fault. We don't produce vaccines in New Zealand. It's been very erratic supply from pharmaceutical companies, but we're not up there on that. And so, Nziia, I don't know if you're seeing anything around the international education side or other areas of...
Not very hopeful here. Is my short answer. But can I just walk into our answer to that in my second response? Okay, so I'll talk very briefly about the diversification part. I think we constantly talk about diversification, but I think most people don't have the answer. Diversification to where, right? So I don't think we have enough awareness of a lot of international markets out there that will sort of be the next better buyer, right? If we were to sort of displace our largest or second largest sort of trading partner, whichever product and services that you're dealing with, right? So in order to get the exercise correct, I think we should all ask the question, right? Do you have a second or third best market to which you can diversify to? And will they actually sort of pay that kind of margins? Right, and that's part of the catch there, right? And I'm just trying to sort of, throw in the business point of view, right? So if the businesses are actually doing well with certain markets because of their high margins, the next better market, you really have to find a similar kind of consumer or customer to which they are happy to pay that kind of margins, right? Because some markets won't be able to pay that kind of margins compared to others. So I want to bear that in mind in that conversation about diversification. Now, reset, last week I was in Christchurch with some of the tertiary students, and it doesn't take me more than about, 1 minute to walk around the Christchurch city and concluded that I suspect that that will be the most modern city in the whole of New Zealand. Because if you've actually been to the Christchurch city most recently, you will see that a lot of things were reset. And well, it's unfortunate it was reset by the earthquake, right? But at the same time, you can see the rebuild there. You can see a lot of buildings are very modern and nothing against the people in Wellington or Auckland, so they will be the best ones around. But it's almost like a shopping mall somewhere in Singapore or somewhere in Malaysia. You can almost tell from the way it's going, right? Now, what I'm saying here is that we are also facing a similar reset in COVID-19, right? So what I want to see build back better is to think about all this regional growth that is coming through in New Zealand, right? I mean, the centers always get a lot of attraction like Auckland and Wellington. So I love Auckland, don't worry. I love Wellington too because I work in both two universities in those two cities, but I think the regions are strong. So I think we should start building it in a way that doesn't have inequality of the kind of progression economically of saying that it's all about Auckland and Wellington, right? Not about the Tarangas, the Hawke's Bays, the Nelsons. They have all the most suns, as you can hear. And then, of course, the other parts of the world, as well, which is the South Island, of course, which has a lot of good things to offer as well. So I can see that as one of the reset. The other reset is in relation to Alan's question about international education. So if we don't reset, right, then that means we are actually going to wait for things to happen, the door to open, and then we are going to rely on tourism another 100%, international education another 100%, and basic agriculture 100%. right? What I'm not saying that we should throw them out as our top 3 export industry, but we should maybe diversify a little bit away, right? Digital education, you know, agriculture technology, and all sorts of things that are related, or even virtual tourism and all sorts of things, right? So even for those 3 industries, I suspect their portfolio can adjust, but at the same time, we can push a lot more other industries into play for a total reset. Since we are in this kind of conundrum, we might as well just do it properly.
Okay. Michael, there's been a number of questions about opening up, not just to the bridge, places like Australia or Cook Island, but beyond that. And The Economist magazine said, could be a new world divide. Used to be first world, second world, third world. Now it's the jabs and the jab-nots, I think they call it. Are you starting to see the world in big, stark public health terms like that?
I think there is a divide between countries that have aimed for extremely low or zero COVID, and they have done much better. They perform very much better from a public health and economic point of view, and a return to normal functioning or greater freedoms by all the metrics we've got. So that, I think, has been the divide in the past. Now I think we are going to see that split into countries that have high vaccine coverage, remembering that all of the high-income countries will have high vaccine coverage in a relatively short period of time, maybe by the end of this year. So it's still not, in the great scheme of things, it's not that far off. I think then the normal divide between high and low-income countries will be even more stark than it has been to date, because you will have this virus continuing to circulate in ever more infectious variants in those low and middle income countries until they have high vaccine coverage. So I think that will become really the big divide. And amongst countries like New Zealand and the other OECD countries, once they have high coverage, you'll see, I think, quite a high level of movement between them, with vaccine passports, I think, inevitable, and with some other controls in terms of pre-departure testing and so on. But I think travel will become pretty manageable at that point. And it's not that far off. I mean, certainly by this time next year, I think that will be the situation. Unfortunately for low-income countries and failed states, I think there'll still be really quite a grim situation. But COVID will just add to the many other terrible health problems and economic problems that they have to contend with. And unfortunately, the world looks like becoming a less equal place with, I think, increasing food insecurity and other major global threats, again, just amplifying the inequality divide. So I think, unfortunately, that's where we're going. One of the things I think we should remember too is, in New Zealand, it has perhaps felt far less effect from the pandemic because we have been so successful in the elimination approach. And we've got a couple of indicators to show that. We've got the Oxford Stringency Index, which has shown right throughout this, we've had far less time under lockdown than virtually every other country on earth. Even though sometimes people said, oh, of course, you must be in lockdown all the time. No, it's actually the opposite. And also, I was interested to see in the Economist magazine, their normalcy index. Some of you may have seen that. I'm not sure if you want to be normal, but it does use quite good scales, and it showed that we are right at the top of that scale, along with Hong Kong, which also has an explicit elimination approach in terms of all the measures of returning to normal life in both internal travel, our social lives, and our ability to go to work and in commercial activities. So that's one reason. It's not just that we feel perhaps less affected. We are less affected by the pandemic because of how we've operated. But as I was saying before, I think we will be able to pivot, I think, quite easily to this new world order for high vaccine coverage countries, and we'll be one of them fairly soon.
Well, thanks, Michael. And we're sort of just reaching an end now. I mean, of course, we do have the best borders in the world, 1,000 kilometres of ocean in every direction. We're the only country in the world like that. So some of it, we're lucky, maybe, as well as just good. Sarah, any things that you would think the government or the private sector, big things, should be doing at this point, or thinking about doing as we move between COVID and more open borders?
So I've just got to pick one thing. I think it will be looking at visa applications. I really think the government needs to throw some resource behind that.
You mean inward visas?
Inward visas, and we really need to try and expedite inward visas of people to do these jobs where we have a mass shortage. We have fruit, expiring on the ground. We have ER departments that are at breaking point. We need to bring in people to do that work. And also I think we should consider expediting visa applications of high net worth individuals who are promising to bring incredible levels of investment and expertise into New Zealand. I think we could well do with that. So I think that'd be my number one thing.
Thanks, Sarah. Brad, your number one thing?
I think we need a plan for how we leverage the opportunity and the position we've found ourselves in. We can start to address some of our long-term issues. We can, strengthen our position in the global community, as a strong actor, as someone who's got some great health thinking, some strong economic outputs. But we can, I think, we've got to sort of grab that bull by the horns and run with it rather than hope that it still exists in some point. It's a perishable commodity, if you will. It will eventually go, and I think now is the time to use it. And unless we have that plan of what the coordinating strategy is, how do we use, say, the popularity of the Prime Minister? That is what people talk about overseas. What is the actual way that we're going to capture that globally? How do we sort of push ourselves forward as a country? And I think, again, be much more active rather than passive when it comes to New Zealand's position on the international stage.
Thanks. Last thing, Nziia?
Yep, so we pride on the New Zealand Inc. brand a lot, right? And to be honest, I mean, in the last 3, 4, 5 years, you will start to feel that, I think we take it for granted that people will buy anything or do anything as long as it's called New Zealand. That's why you see a lot of fakes out there, right? Not just products, but services-wise as well. What I'm trying to alert you to is the fact that, there is no better place actually now, no better timing now for New Zealand Inc. brand, because after that taken for granted situation that we have to promote and sell more of the New Zealand brand, we find ourselves in a very good position. Pandemic will sell all the good things that we have, right? Quality products, clean products, services, and all sorts of things will actually sort of promote itself, right, into those markets as well. So I want to encourage us to not waste this opportunity, right, to actually, again, don't take it for granted by not selling, but promoting or articulating, but do that, but make sure that New Zealand Inc. brand is actually out there, because I suspect that because of this pandemic, I think the New Zealand Inc. brand is actually going to play to our strength again for the next 15 months or so.
Okay, thank you very much, Nziia. Thank you, panel. Michael.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say one last point is we've obviously got a great reputation, as I think everyone's pointing out, for using science and having an evidence-informed response. But actually our science centre, our science capacity is really suffering in New Zealand. We spend half the OECD average on R&D, much less in Australia. I think it's about 1.3%. That is dismal, and that is not going to support, it's not going to leverage off this new recognition that science is right at the heart of our driving our policy responses. So we have to look after our scientists and give our emerging scientists, some of them in the room, somewhere to go, a future, because it's not there at the moment. There's just not enough investment in this sector.
Thanks very much. Thanks, everybody on the panel. I don't know how many problems we actually solved today, but maybe something in there. Thank you very much.